Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll be talking about the most common errors in filing submissions and how to avoid them. My name's Dan Woods, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. Joining me, we have a number of members of the team today. First up is Sam Kalir, who is our Professional Services and Delivery Consultant. Next, we'll hear from Tom Howells, a Senior Specialist from our development team. Tom has a focus on CRD 4 filing and Solvency 2 filing. And later on, we'll be joined by Colin Hudson, who will take us through a short demo of Beacon. Now, just a quick mention of the structure of today's webinar. We will, at about the halfway point, have a poll where we'll ask the audience a couple of questions about their experiences for filing. And also, we'll be holding a question and answer section at the end of the presentation where our panelists will answer any questions that you might have. If you'd like to submit a question, you can use the questions box on the side of your screen, as you can see here. Okay, so let's start the webinar. I'll hand over to Sam.
Thanks, Dan. So to run through our agenda for today, we're going to look a little bit at the background of Eurofiling, a little introduction, and then we'll move through the XBRL taxonomies of CRD 4 and Solvency 2. And then Tom will take us through how to create a filing, the process of this, and looking at error messages and how to interpret these, and some of the best practices which will hopefully ensure that you don't have so many issues coming up when you're trying to make your submission. So, I will start us off with discussing Eurofiling, a little bit about what it is and where it's from. The Eurofiling mandates arose from some Europe-wide legislation that was introduced following the financial crisis in 2008. This led to the creation of the European System of Financial Supervision, or ESFS, in 2010. The ESFS is made up of the European Systemic Risk Board and 3 European Supervisory Authorities, or ESAs. As you can see on the slide, these are the European Banking Authority, or EBA, the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority, also known as EIOPA, and the European Securities and Markets Authorities, or ESMA. So the EBA defines the regulatory financial reporting taxonomy in CRD 4, and their main objectives are to maintain financial stability in the EU and safeguard integrity, efficiency, and basically orderly functioning of the banking sector. The EIOPA defines the regulatory financial reporting taxonomy in Solvency 2, and they monitor and identify trends, potential risks, any vulnerabilities across the insurance sector, and they use this to help shape policies and laws at EU and national level. We're not going to discuss ESMA today because they still haven't officially published an XBRL taxonomy, but they are planning on soon. So in order for the EBA and EIOPA to fulfill their objectives, they collaborated with XBRL Europe and stakeholders in order to develop the Eurofiling initiative. And this specifies the financial regulatory information that the ESAs collect so as they can monitor banks, insurance companies and markets to watch for risks and any signs of trouble brewing. So let's look at the actual reporting process. The supervisory authorities, EBA and EIOPA, provide the XBRL taxonomies that define the specific pieces of data that they want to collect, together with any data attributes and the relationships between each of the data elements. Filers are then required to submit their data that's also in XBRL format, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in detail later. On this slide you can see the reporting process, where I've used the UK as an example. As I said earlier, the EBA defines the CRD 4 taxonomy, and this route is shown in green, and the EIOPA defines the Solvency 2 taxonomy, and this is the route shown in orange. They both follow the same reporting process structure, whereby the filer submits their XBRL submission via a portal to their local National Competent Authority, or NCA, and the NCA then submits a subset of this data to their ESA. The ESAs then supply a further subset of this data to the ESRB, so as the ESRB has macroprudential oversight of the EU financial system, and this is with a view of prevention and mitigation of systemic risk. So, for CRD4 in the UK, credit institutions and investment firms submit their data via the Gabriel portal to the Financial Conduct Authority, who then submit to the EBA. And then for Solvency 2 in the UK, insurance firms submit their data via the BEADS portal, and this is to the Bank of England Prudential Regulation Authority, who then submit to EIOPA. In other countries, the NCA for CRD4 and Solvency 2 may be the same body. For instance, in Italy, it's the Banca d'Italia, but there's a list of all the NCAs by country on the EBA website. As a historical point, the NCAs were originally referred to as National Supervisory Authorities, or NSAs, and some sources may actually still use this name for these bodies. Next, we're going to discuss the structure of the taxonomy, but I'll start off by saying a little bit more about XBRL. XBRL is a global standard for financial reporting. It's intended to encourage transparency and consistency. It's primarily computer readable. It's not intended for a human to look at or interpret directly. So anytime we're referring to someone using a taxonomy, what we really mean is that they're using their XBRL software with the taxonomy. The taxonomy defines each of the data elements that have to be reported by the filer, and the taxonomy validation rules define how each of those data elements relate to each other. When an organisation publishes a taxonomy, they usually do it via a taxonomy package. And this is a zip folder that contains all the taxonomy files and some metadata that software tools find useful, such as the name of the taxonomy and any information about what's available in the package. In order to use a taxonomy package, it must be installed into some XBRL software. The exact process of this depends on the software, so some software can be configured by the user to use any taxonomy package, while other software will have specific taxonomy packages installed by the manufacturer and will then require a separate software update when a new taxonomy is released. A selection of relevant taxonomy packages can be downloaded from our website for free and by anyone. There's a link on our slide for this. It's taxonomies.corefiling.com. And this includes all the packages necessary to configure software for Eurofiling. A new version of each taxonomy is released once a year in line with changes in regulations. But in addition to this, an updated version of this taxonomy may be released one or more times per year with any additional changes. It's up to the filer to ensure that the filing is prepared against the latest version of the taxonomy, unless of course it's a resubmission. And ensuring a filing is submitted against the correct and most up-to-date taxonomy is a cause of failed submissions. So Tom will actually come back to this point a little bit later on. So let's take a look at the structure of each of the taxonomies. As the slide says, CRD4 is made up of the CRD, which is at a national level, and the CRR, which is at an EU level. The CRD4 taxonomy specifies a number of reporting frameworks, of which CoreFiling and FinRep are probably the most widely known. And in January 2018, FinRep will adopt the IFRS 9 standard for financial reporting, and this will be included in the updated taxonomy. Other reporting frameworks include AE, which is asset encumbrance, or SBP, which is supervisory benchmarking portfolios. Each of these frameworks represents a kind of report, and each contains a number of different XBRL entry points. So entry points can be thought of as different formats of the report to suit the filer who's actually making the report. So for CRD4, nearly all of the reporting frameworks can be submitted in solo or consolidated format, depending on whether the company is owns another part of the company or is considered an individual entity. Again, it's the responsibility of the filer to identify the correct report or reports to make. Solvency 2 defines the technical Moving on to Solvency 2. This defines the technical standards and reporting requirements for the regulation of insurance firms. So like CRD4, there are a number of frameworks within the quantitative reporting templates, and a few of these are shown on the slide. Similarly to CRD4, solo and consolidated or group entities are distinguished. And there is a difference because you get an annual reporting solo for Solvency 2, but there's also an annual reporting group. More information on each of these frameworks is given on the IOPA website, and there's plenty of links on the slide. So together with the XBRL taxonomies, both the EBA and IOPA also published an XBRL filing manual, and that contains a set of filing rules that all filers should obey. The links to the relevant manuals are available from the slide, and you just need to follow through that link to actually reach either the latest or the latest published version. These are the instructions for filers about the technical details of the filing, and they specify things such as the currencies to use, the precision for different types of facts, what rounding should apply, and a whole host of other things. Now, many of these rules are not directly represented in the taxonomy, but both national competent authorities apply validation based around the ones that can be sensibly tested, such as currencies, minimum precision, or using the wrong entry point. So I'm going to stop here, but hopefully I've given you a brief introduction into the background of CRD4 and Solvency II. And before Tom starts on how to avoid some of these errors encountered during submission, I'm going to hand back to Daniel.
Great, thanks very much, Sam, for that overview. And just a quick note to our attendees and listeners today, our apologies, a couple of you might have heard a slight echo at the start of this webinar. That should have stopped now, but do give us a message if you can still hear it. Okay, so before we move on to specific examples of filing errors that you might receive and how to deal with them, we'd like to take a short poll. So you will see a question flash up on your screen in just a moment if you haven't already got it. Okay, so the first question is, what is the most common problem you face when submitting a filing? Is it incorrect data, ambiguous error messages, an out-of-date mandate, conflicting error messages, or something else? Just click the answer that you'd like to submit on the screen. I'll give you a few moments to do that. Great stuff. And we have one more question coming up in just a few moments. And our second and final question, how do you typically solve your reporting problems? Is it by using validation software? Do you ask your regulator for help? Is it through looking for help internally, by searching on the internet, or through something else? Again, we'll just give a minute or so for people to submit their answers. They're coming in now. Nearly there. Okay, and that's it for our poll. We have a couple of clear winning answers. We'll come back to those a little bit later. Okay, so now to carry on with the webinar, I'm going to hand back over to Tom.
Thank you again, Daniel. So now we're going to go through the process of creating a filing. So as a quick overview of the whole process, if a filer wants to make one of these filings, first thing they need to do is obtain the correct taxonomy and the correct entry point. And then they need to convert from XBRL to a set of tables. This will be done with some sort of software. For example, you might get an Excel format spreadsheet to fill in, which you would then fill out the tables that you've got in whatever format. Then the software will need to convert the completed tables back to XBRL to make an XBRL document, which is then submitted to the regulator via the portal. When this is done, the regulator will run a series of validation checks on the document. And indeed, this might be the first time that a filer knows there is a problem with the submission. So there's three possible states for a filing when it's submitted. It could fail validation, it could receive warnings from the validation, or it could pass validation. Obviously, to pass validation means everything is fine, the filing has been accepted. Failing validation is equally simple in that the filer will need to make some corrections before the filing will be accepted. If, however, you get a warning, then the filing will be accepted, but there is an expectation that the filer will look at the warnings that have been given and potentially correct them at some point. So just to give a quick idea, this is an example table from FINRA in CRD4. So the filer will get a table of this form and we'll just need to fill in the empty columns with their data, which is nice and simple, but then it must be converted to XBRL afterwards. So the top 5 problems that people have with this sort of submission is firstly finding the correct taxonomy, secondly interpreting the error message that come back from the portal, and then leading on from that, incorrect data entry is a problem people have, excessively large filings, especially with these two mandates, and then a more niche problem is people having correct data that fails validation, and we'll discuss each of these with an example. So the first one is finding the correct taxonomy. So why do people find this to be a problem? So the correct version of a taxonomy will depend on the reporting period. And unlike some other taxonomies, with these mandates, the version numbers do not immediately indicate which period they are valid for. So for example, corporation tax uses this strategy to help make it clearer which taxonomy is used for which reporting period. So really the best solution I can offer you in this space is to use the CoreFiling mandate picker, which is a free tool available from our website, which for these two taxonomies can help you find the relevant entry points and the relevant taxonomy to use. So interpreting error messages. When an XBRL filing is submitted to the regulator's portal, it will run through a series of validation steps. This starts off with very basic validation, which checks whether the filing is valid XBRL, and then moves on to XBRL formula validation and filing rule validation. So XBRL validation is, as I said, very basic validation, and any failures in this area will likely make the filing invalid, and will also mean that formula validation and filing rule validation will likely not be run on the instance. So any XBRL failures will need to be fixed before filing rule or formula checks can be run. To help explain so there are three possible severities here for failures. Warning, which we've sort of already discussed. Error, which is a validation or filing rule failure. Or fatal error, which means that the XBRL was invalid. And fatal error will mean that the subsequent validation will not be run. So I'll talk a little bit more now about XBRL formula validation. So these are validation rules that are in the taxonomy, but it's not really feasible to read the rules directly out of the taxonomy because they are written in a very technical way. It is possible with software, but it's still very difficult. So both the EBA and EOPA publish spreadsheets which contain all of the validation rules in the taxonomy in a more human-readable form. So we will cover this in a bit more detail later. But just so you know, we've provided links to the validation spreadsheets for you to look at. So as an example of the sort of error messages you might get from these taxonomies, we have a selection of error messages from Solvency 2. And hopefully you can immediately see how all of these messages vary in the amount of detail they give and how helpful they are. For example, item cannot be empty is particularly unhelpful when taken in isolation, whereas some of the others are a bit more specific and a bit easier to understand. So what we're going to do is go through in a bit more detail how you would go from an error message in a very raw form to understanding what it actually means. So on the screen now you can see a very raw error message from a validation tool. So this one is in fact in XML format, and I'm sure you'll agree it's not the easiest thing to read. So the message detail block in the center is the actual error message that the taxonomy defines. And I know from experience that this is the kind of error message that you get when XBRL formula are used for an existence assertion. But you will notice that it doesn't tell you exactly which data is missing. It is expecting a piece of data and it hasn't found it, but it's not really telling you what's missing. It's just telling you that the rule ID that failed. So the only way to find out which piece of data is missing really here is to check the validation spreadsheet. So we're just going to drop into that now. Good. So hopefully you can all see this correctly. I'm just going to quickly explain this validation sheet and how it works. And hopefully that will help you the next time you need to do this. So you see the first column on the left here, this is the rule ID. So this is the ID that will be reported in the error message from the taxonomy. Note that in this particular case, the rule IDs in the taxonomy are the rules from are the IDs from the spreadsheet, but prepended with EBA underscore. So in the actual taxonomy, for example, this rule would be EBA underscore V0172 underscore M. So this sheet gives you quite a wealth of information. It tells you the last time the rule was changed, what the change was, whether the rule was deactivated or reactivated, and we might come back to this in a minute. It tells you the severity of the rule. It tells you which tables the rule affects, when I can get there. It has a number of columns here that determine rows, columns, or sheets. And finally, finally, the formula. So this is usually the most interesting column for a filer, because having taken their rule ID and looked it up in the spreadsheet, they can look at the actual formula which the rule is running. So if I just look for, sorry, you can't see the search box. Yep. So if I search for the rule that I was previously looking at, we can see that this is added in version 2.3. It's an existence check. It's actually non-blocking. And you can see there it affects table F00.01. And if we go all the way over to the formula, you can see that this is actually referring to the cell at row 10, column 10 in table F00.01. And it is asking that this cell exists effectively. So hopefully that sort of helps you to figure out how to go from the error message to the rule, and then hopefully you can find that cell and fill it in successfully. So just a quick point about these formulae. You'll notice that the EBA have an overall format and then shorthands of it. So for example, in these existence assertions, the format of a cell reference is to have the table ID first, then the row number, then the column number, and possibly the sheet number as well, which we may cover later. But in other examples, they sometimes omit any of these where it is common throughout all of the elements in the formula. So for example here, they've specified only the row numbers. To identify which columns and tables are referenced, you need to look to the left at the rows, at the columns, sorry. So here we can see actually all of these rows that are referenced are in table F3201. And actually this applies to a number of columns. So this applies to all of the columns 10, 20, 30, 60, 70, 80. So actually this is a very complicated rule that has been described in a very simple way, which is nice for the EBA, but potentially quite complicated for filers. So coming back to our error messages, we just discussed the formula validation sheet, and it's quite a technical document, not always the easiest thing to read. So coming back to another example, when you have a more complicated error message, this might be a bit more difficult to follow through than the simple existence assertion. So here is the full piece of XML that you might get for a more complicated failure. And although you can hopefully pick out the rule ID in the middle, you can see that it's not giving you a lot of information about which cells this was identifying. So again, if we cut that down, we can see the key pieces of information actually from there are the severity, the error code, and the ID from the rule spreadsheet. And if we so decide, we could plug that ID into the validation spreadsheet and go and look up this rule and find out which cells were actually referenced by this error message. So one thing I would say is that a lot of the regulator portals will give you some assistance in interpreting these error messages. For example, they may pull out just the key points from them, so you might only see the severity, the error code, the ID, and the message. And hopefully that now means you have enough information to go back to the validation sheets and identify the formula that was actually used. As a final note here, not all validation failures are XBRL formula. And here's a quick cheat sheet for you. If you look at your error code, so in both of the previous ones, it was xbrl.xiif.assertion unsatisfied. And this just gives you an idea of which documentation to look at when you get a certain error code. And hopefully that's useful to you. So moving on to incorrect data entry. So this really is where you filled in all the cells that you think you need, but for some reason the rule is still failing, and this could be a problem with incorrect data entry. So there's a few points here that we'll cover, and we'll give examples of each of these: rounding of numerical data, duplicate data points, data types, and default values. So starting with rounding. So I've summarized here the EBA filing rules for numeric facts in somewhat plainer English than they're actually defined as. The accuracy must be expressed using the XBRL at decimals attribute. No truncation, rounding, no truncation or rounding should be applied to the values. And the accuracy that is stated should be realistic and not excessively high. So note here, accuracy is the value of accuracy that is specified by the at decimals attribute rather than referring to any rounding that was done prior to that. And the reasoning here is really quite simple. So for example, if I used infinite precision and I add 20 million to 20 million, that would be equal to 40 million, but 20 million and 1 plus 20 million would not be equal to 40 million. However, it might be quite common for the totals in particular to be rounded or truncated to, say, 40 million, which the computer would then see as inconsistent. So, in particular with totals, they should not be reported to an unreasonably high precision. And there is guidance in the filing rules to this effect. So, duplicate data points. So there are a number of cases in these mandates where a single report will contain the same data point in multiple tables. So conceptually, if two cells represent the same data point, they must be consistent. But in fact, there are filing rules in both mandates that state that in such a situation, each fact must only be submitted once. So this is a thing that filing software will hopefully help you with, because it's not very easy by hand to identify duplicate data points. And I mean, there is the obvious case that if different values are entered into each of these data points, that is an inconsistent duplicate and will not pass filing rules. Data types. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but you're hopefully all aware that there are a number of data types available in these taxonomies. I've given you a little cheat sheet here, which is taken from the CRD4 documentation. So these are based primarily on software engineer data types with a few extra XBRL ones thrown in, such as monetary. And really you just need to be very careful when you're using these data types that you're using the correct ones from the taxonomy and that you're complying with the specifications for how they should be used, what precision to use for them, and what reporting units, for example. And essentially, filing software should be helping with this, should really be doing most of this behind the scenes, but this may not always be the case. So moving on to default values. XBRL formula will usually assume that a cell that is left blank is 0. And this most of the time will be fine. But I just wanted to mention here the use of filing indicators in Solvency 2 and CRD4. So a filing indicator is an element in the XBRL document that tells the validation engine which tables have been submitted in an instance document. Now, validation rules for a table will usually not run if the filing indicator is not present. However, if the filing indicator exists, any empty cells will likely be interpreted as 0 by validation rules. This could be a problem if there is any validation that crosses multiple tables. So for instance, if there is a check that the values on one table match the values on the second table, then if the second table has not been filled in, but the filing indicator has been submitted, this could be the cause of some slightly hard to understand errors where the validation rule may complain about a table that hasn't been filled in. So it's worth knowing about. And really the fix here is to avoid submitting unused filing indicators. So large filings, again, I'm going to keep this one fairly brief, but some reports, as the slide says, can grow very large for a big company. This is unavoidable due to the nature of the mandates. But just for reference, a 2 GB instance for Solvency 2 requires 64 GB of RAM to process in a validation engine of choice. This requires 64-bit software, and even creating instances that are 2 GB will probably require 64-bit software, and this could be a problem that filers run into if they're using older hardware or software. So, having gone through all of that, there may be times when a filer is looking at their data and is entirely confident that their data is correct and in filled in correctly, or the XBRL is correct, and it may still fail the validation. So in particular cases, this may in fact not be the filer's fault, because there have been instances where the validation rules as published did not function as the regulator expected. And I would say that this is getting a lot less common as the taxonomies mature. But going back to the spreadsheet, if we remember, there were a number of validation rules that were deactivated. So any regulator running the validation should not be running any rules that are deactivated. So if you have a validation rule failure and it appears as deactivated, then it's definitely something worth contacting the regulator about. It's also worth checking the lists of known issues with these taxonomies to make sure that this isn't a known issue. And if you've been through all of that and you're still confident that your data is correct, but it's failing validation, it is worth contacting the regulator to report the possible problem. These days, this is only likely to happen for rules introduced in the last year or since the last reporting time. So please check the creation dates as well. So as a final point here, especially with larger companies, there may be a number of stakeholders involved in an XBRL filing. And the XBRL formula and the XBRL filing rules help somewhat with consistency, but what they cannot account for is information that is simply incorrect. So your data could pass all of the filing rules, but simply not be a fair representation of the company's position. So it is always worth having a manual check of the final document. And here, where I say final document, I mean the XBRL version of the document, because you wouldn't want your table version to look perfectly correct and then the actual XBRL document to be different to what you were looking at in the table. So here it is definitely worth analyzing the final document before it is submitted to the portal. So there may indeed be a review process between multiple stakeholders looking at the final document to ensure everyone's happy with it before a submission is made. And here really you need some software that understands XBRL to do this. So I hope you're happy that we've run through the process of creating filing from the beginning to submitting to the regulator and passing the validation. And in summary, we have a number of things that you can check and a little checklist here for you to run through if your filing is being rejected. But I would say that appropriate software can help you with an awful lot of these problems. So thank you for listening. I'm passing back to Daniel now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Tom, for a really detailed look, actually, at some of the errors that people will commonly come across and what to do with them. Now, before we move on to Colin and his software presentation, our attendees will remember taking a short poll earlier on, and I'd like to just reveal the results, which hopefully tie in quite well with what we've just heard. So the first question we asked you was, what is the most common problem you face when submitting a filing? The answers were incorrect data, ambiguous error messages, out-of-date mandates, conflicting error messages, or something else. I'm happy to say there was a clear winner here, that most people attending us, our webinar today thought that incorrect data was the most common problem they faced. And the second question we asked was, how do you typically solve your reporting problems? We had two joint winning answers here, which were by using the validation software and by looking for help internally with problems. Okay, so today we've heard quite a lot about the different types of filing errors. Tom and Sam have given us a lot of hints and tips on how to avoid those errors when you create your filings and what to do if your filing is rejected by the regulator. But the best way overall to avoid all the kinds of problems we've been hearing about today is to actually open, review and validate your XBRL filing before you send it to the regulator. At CoreFiling, we've developed a piece of software that will let you do just this, and it's called Beacon. So I'd like to hand over now to Colin Hudson to show us Beacon, take us through how it works and what it does.
Just an instance of a CRD4 report or instance, and you can see okay, apparently I was muted. Apologies, so I'll start again. So what we're looking at here is an instance or a report for the CRD4 mandate, and as we look through the screen, what we can see is that there is a set of context which refers to the tables that are being submitted in this report. but perhaps most importantly for the context of this presentation is there is a checklist. And as Tom said earlier, there is a hierarchy, if you like, of validation checks that are being gone through every time that this gets validated. And we can see here that there is a problem with the formula validation. Everything else has passed, hence the green ticks, but with the ZIF formulas, there is an error. And if we scroll further down, we can see that there are two areas which are incorrect. And you can see the error code there as well, which is, as we saw in the list. Now, if I expand on the causes, what we can see is that there are some cells which are invalid, and we can see on the screen what the causes of those were. So if we look at the to the right of the screen here, where we've got the error code displayed, it's actually telling me exactly what the problem is, and it's saying that column 050 should be equal to the sum of columns 070 to 190, and they're highlighted in red, as you can see. But if we hover over the cells themselves, it will tell you where they originally came from and what they refer to. If we then look to the panel on the right, we can see there are more details about the reporting concept that is being validated. And we can see here that where it comes from and what the various entities, who's it for, what's the period, and what's the actual value being reported, etc. So that's a very kind of quick overview of the ease of use of this. But what I guess it's important to understand that core filings, or at least one of our objectives, is to hide XBRL as much as possible from the business user, so that these kinds of tools make available all of the power of the validation without having to go through what I think you'll agree is a fairly complex process if you use the manual approach. So with that, I'd like to hand back to Daniel.
Great stuff. Thank you, Colin. That was Colin Hudson taking us through a demo and we would now like to move on to the question and answer section. We've been getting questions from our attendees throughout this presentation, so I'm just going to pick the first one and hand it over to our panel. Okay, the first question that we've received is, I can see that there's a new report type available for the ALMs. We are currently using 2.501 additional liquidity monitoring core app, and I see that there's now a version 2.6 available. Which one should we be using for May's reporting ALMs? We'll hand that over to Sam.
This is where Mandate Picker is really handy, as you can put in the reporting period and it will show you which version of that particular mandate to use. The link for this was on the slide, so I think it was on slide 13 maybe, but it's corefiling.com/mandate-picker.
Brilliant stuff, thank you for that, Sam. Our next audience question, is there a way to automate a lot of the submission process so that I spend less time working out what the validation errors mean? I'm going to pass that one over to Colin, if I may.
Absolutely, there is, yes. So when we're looking at Beacon just now, there is Beacon is actually part of the True North platform and is a component as such. And what it brings is the ability to have APIs which can be connected into other solutions, which can automate the process of uploading the submission into Beacon so that it's there ready and available at any given time. Now, given that it is a cloud or server-based solution, what that means is that it's available to anybody. So where this data is being brought together from various sources, that is often the case, then people can work collaboratively on solving the problem.
Great, thank you for that, Colin. I'm just conscious of time, but I think we've got enough time for one more audience question. What are the expected future requirements and changes to taxonomies? Sam, would you mind taking us through that one?
Well, any future changes will actually be determined by EU legislation. This will happen every year. For instance, the release date is July 2017. For a 2017 fourth quarter submission, which is in February 2018. So any following updates to fix bugs or any additional changes may follow that.
Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you for squeezing that last one in for us, Sam. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. That marks the end of today's webinar. But before we bring it to a close, there's just one more thing we'd like to talk to everybody about. We'd like to invite everyone who's joined us today on this webinar to try reviewing and validating their next filing for free through our cloud-based validation platform Beacon that Colin showed us earlier. Just to reiterate, this trial is totally free. All you need is your name, company, and email address, and this allows you to upload a filing, review it for errors with as many colleagues as you like. You can check for all the errors we talked about today, specific validation fixes to the data where needed, and we'll actually store your filing in our cloud for up to 3 years. Just to confirm, we'll be sending out all the details of the Beacon trial today in an email after this webinar, and you'll also receive the slide deck from the webinar today and a link to the recording when it's available. Okay, so that marks the end of today's webinar. If we weren't able to get to any of your questions, please do get in touch by visiting us at CoreFiling.com and clicking the Contact Us button. And all that remains to say is to say thank you for joining us today from myself, Dan Woods, Tom Howells, Sam Killet, and Colin Hudson. Thank you.